So I'm introducing my son Colt and myself because Colt and I, over the years, he's been working with me on the Frid Framework, which it's multidimensional and it covers a lot of things to do with architecture and struggles where we've come up against things where architecture has somewhat defied logic and had to deal with the realities of implementing lightweight implementations of architecture as opposed to classical forms of centralized architecture systems. And from the time that long enough ago that I don't even want to talk about it, that I was sitting on a board of directors and I was constantly being asked the same questions by our chief executive officer and the chief financial officer, that I started to realize that what we were doing in enterprise architecture wasn't responding to that C-suite organization, and we weren't giving them the type of answers that they were looking for. Enterprise architecture is very much a ground roots up-based development. It came out of IMIT, as you all know. I don't have to talk to you about that. But it's reached a ceiling and it's evolved and it's slowly converged from a fractious organization of different standards and different methodologies, and they are beginning to converge, and we're now at the level of capabilities and capability-based planning. I like to put this particular motto up here because it's off of the old Serenity prayer, where it's, grant me the serenity to accept things I can't change. I like the fact that I'm trying to find wisdom to change those things that I can't accept. And so I always like that as a motto to drive us. So when we're talking about enterprise architecture frameworks, on the screen I'm showing you the evolution of enterprise architecture itself, where back in the old days we would try and glue stuff together and try and figure out what's in, what's out, what matters, what doesn't. And since it was grassroots oriented, we were IMIT driven, always pushed IMIT. And then it's made its way up into the point where it's been able to embody the project pipeline, and you see it now starting to get into capabilities in a serious way, predominantly military driven. The military's wanted to be in capability-based planning for quite a while, and they've gone through 4 major cycles here in Canada, and they're in their 4th cycle, and each evolution has been a significant re-engineering of what it is that we meant by capability-based planning. And during level 3, I was brought in to work on C4ISR, and we completely revamped not only the enterprise architecture framework, but not DNDAF itself, but how it was implemented for doing capability-based planning, but also the governance structure for the organization. What was the business model for the organization so that capability-based planning could work with the business model? Because for the first time, we were able to sit down with the actual senior executives of the organization. So we worked with the vice, and we worked with the various admirals and generals that had the same problems that I ran into years ago as a CIO on a board of directors. They asked the exact same questions. So whether you're in private sector, public sector, religious organizations, nonprofit, those same types of questions seem to bubble up to the surface. And where enterprise architecture began to not answer the questions that the seniors were asking, we started to develop tools and something that could be repeatable across multiple organizations in multiple sectors. And that's where we try to fill in certain areas of the red area up there where we find that enterprise architecture frameworks are still maturing. They're trying to probe into certain areas and cover certain things. Now, the latest breakthrough for us was Unified Architecture Framework, because it took us sort of a quantum leap forward, and that's a big improvement. But there's still some issues with that. Next slide, please. When we look at what we have to deal with when we're reporting into the senior executives, they're always concerned about future state. And they're looking way off. And I'm not just talking about current trends, which is something where architecture is trying to float its boat right now and get into there. But they're looking at, you know, what happens if in multiple scenarios. And they're looking at then multiple alternate futures. Because in military, it's very succinct what you're looking at. And in private sector, it's less succinct, yet they're doing the same thing, they just don't realize it. Where we are waging war on multiple fronts, and I mean to stack that in multiple dimensions. And what we're doing is we're probing in these dimensions to find weaknesses. And if we find a weakness in one dimension, it lets us get in behind these other dimensions where they're strong. So we're always looking forward on these particular architectural viewpoints to see what do we want to be when we grow up and what's potentially going to hit us as some type of disruptive, not just technology, but emergent trends or patterns or political landscapes, geopolitical, temporal. There's a variety of dimensions that we have to weigh when we're trying to figure out how to represent this graphically so that we have a repeatable set of views that we can give to the seniors. So we came up first with the innovation process, and that was actually very novel, and we took that to the board at Public Works, and they liked that. And so we began to flush it out. What does this mean really, you know, because it was a concept and we had to try and figure out how to add more and more meat to this so that we can continually deliver substance. And that's a pretty hefty body of work that we're not going to talk about right now. I wanted to show it to you though as a bridge because there is constant research done by defense research, who I spend most of my time working for defense these days. And between what Colt and I are up to, we have to take the information that's done by defense research and bring that into an architectural framework and start to manipulate that. And then from the output of that, develop pilot projects, go through proper governance, and manage that in a way that is provided, that I'm thinking that will eventually feed this through and it will become additional layers or additional content within something like a unified architecture framework. But we had to develop the governance viewpoint because when we were dealing with any one of these architectural frameworks, and it didn't matter, TOGAF, DODAF, DNDAF, NAF, they all worked their way up to capabilities. And they call that the strategic layer. Well, that's not strategic. Okay? Strategy is not capabilities. Capabilities are used to achieve objectives. And I set my objectives based on the outcomes that I want to have. So I need something much more rigorous on dealing with outcomes, objectives, and then eventually getting to capabilities, because it's capabilities that I wind up resourcing. I'm going to put capital, people, assets into capabilities, but I need to point them at something. So I'm going to wind up pointing those at objectives. So I got to figure out what my objectives are. So there are things that are that kept coming up that frameworks were not helping me deliver deliverables to the people that wanted to see them. I could deliver stuff to the CIO, but that wasn't the person asking the questions. So the Department of National Defense has capability-based planning, but they've now integrated that right up into their entire planning suite. And that's something the rest of the departments are looking at, not necessarily there yet. Agencies and private sector is looking at what they're doing, because there's a lot of work being done on the forefront here that is being tested. And right now, we've built this, what you see in yellow up there, and if we could move to the next slide, talking about the capabilities. I was showing you how even in the most modern of architecture frameworks, UAF, we've been working with this while it's been in its infancy and migrating and watching everything that OMG and Magic Draw and all their partners have been doing to grow this, and being very excited about it. But when they get to this layer called the strategic layer, once again, it's really predominantly about capabilities. There are some things in there about phasing of the organizational cycles, but it's not enough to report to senior executives. It doesn't give them what they need. And enterprise architects are always asking, why don't we ever get invited to sit in with the board of directors or the executives? Why are we always stuck down here? Why are we always dealing with IMIT stuff all the time? It's because we don't quite have the maturity in the frameworks yet to deliver the deliverables, to answer the questions that the people at the executive level want to see. So, next slide. Before we could start dealing with this, because the capabilities was the top of the framework layer, where they called it strategy, as you saw, but it's really capabilities. And because defense is capability-based planning, the interesting thing is you'd sit in with admirals, generals, whomever, and you say, well, what's a capability? And they go, well, you know, everybody would go, it's a, and they could answer it with one sentence, or, you know, maybe a couple of sentences, and they'd try to wrap their brain around what is that capability. Well, it's complicated. And so Colt and I said, we need to sit down and really think about what is a capability. You know, we can't just say that we've got a taxonomy of capabilities. We can't just say, well, this one is, you know, generalized to this one, so it's its parent, it inherits from. You know, these are classic UML, IMIT relationship stuff making its way up into the top layer to help us as a nomenclature to bind these things together, but it doesn't tell us what it is. So we had to break it apart piece by piece, and we came up with a reference model that we use that we could come back to on a regular basis and talk to people about what is a capability. And I'm not going to go through all the parts and pieces because I'm limited here to 45 minutes, and I've pretty much packed it full of slides. So if you have any questions, just if you could just hold them off till the end, and I'll answer anything you got. I'll get out of the way of the next speaker. And otherwise, I'll let Colt answer everything. I'm kidding. So based on the capability reference model, we came up with a viewpoint that deals with governance. And we said governance is about human decision-making. So what goes into the human decision-making cycle? And we looked at the different views that would be required to explain answers to questions that were being thrown at us by the vice or the chief or the deputy minister. And they would only come to you briefly, and they would want succinct answers, and they want to see it their way. And very often, when in doubt, we fall back on financials, because financials are things that people understand when they don't understand other things that are more complicated. So if we can take some of the really complicated stuff, use architecture and architectural frameworks, and graphically represent some of this stuff to the seniors, they see a picture, they get it, and then they're out the door, and they make whatever decisions they need to make. But it's converting complexity into a graphical format that we try to create these viewpoints. So there are a set of tools that we migrate through. Now the first one, next slide please, it deals with problem definition. And here's where we hide a huge amount of complexity, because we developed a multidimensional matrix based on neural network technology that is based on questions, not data. And that was important because we found that the questions being asked by the seniors were repetitive. And so we were able to synthesize those into a matrix and realize there were relationships between the questions that they were asking. And then we figured out how to weight those relationships and score those relationships. And then the information aggregates and bubbles up so that when they come in and they want to know about this particular problem, not only do they get an answer in multiple dimensions, anything that basically any of the who, what, when, where, why type questions. You notice I don't say how. There is one called the unknown, but how deals with the solution. Okay? We leave how out of it. Who, what, when, where, why, and the unknown becomes the problem space. And with it, we also measure confidence, so that when they see the information being presented to them, they also get a weight. And that weight is just a factor, a percentage. We don't tell them what's good or what's bad, they just see a percentage. And it's how confident all the researchers and the effort that went into exploring that particular problem, how confident they were in their responses. And it bubbles up, aggregates, subtracts, correlates, and then there's a score. And some executives look at the score and say, that's too high a risk, so go back and do some more research. Other executives say, that's fine, I can live with that risk, and they move forward. So, but at least they're aware of the level of confidence the entire team put into researching the problem at hand in all of the dimensions that they care about. Next slide. So we take the problem statement and we use that to begin synthesizing a business model on a page. Now, there's an earlier body of research that was done by a man named Oswalder, who came up with a business model on a page. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen that canvas and may have used it. But I found it again that there was something that it wasn't answering enough questions that the seniors were asking. So we broke it into further layers of granularity so that there was a continuum all the way across from your basic inputs, outputs, transformation, and value proposition at the end. It starts with your drivers, your inputs, authority, regulatory, stakeholders, partners, suppliers, research. The bottom part is all financial, and where you see revenue streams in government, we typically remove that and put KPIs and various measures that are of interest. But in private sector, they're more interested in where revenue streams are coming from. Capabilities are at the top. Over on the right-hand side, that's why. Well, why do we bother doing that? Key timing cycles, various events, and key risk factors. Now, we use this on every project that we work on inside of defense because it can bring the whole team around, and you have one sheet of paper that has bullets. This is what we're doing. Bam, bam, bam. Not only does it allow you to keep your meetings focused, and that's really important, because when you get into meetings, we've all sat in meetings, right, where there's a lot of people sitting around and conversations leap from topic to topic to topic, depending on who the specialist is. And the problem is that it's very difficult to corral that, and sometimes you walk out of those meetings and you feel that you've accomplished nothing. Other times you might have, but this way you can take one box at a time, focus on it, nail it, move on to the next meeting. Take a box, nail it, move on to the next one. Eventually you've got yourself a synopsis of a business model, and this becomes a tool. You can move things around and say, well, if I change the channel in which I'm delivering this service, how would that affect these other things? Or if my business driver changes, how does that affect? And you can look at the ripple effects and have conversations at a senior level, not way down in the dirt where people are, having to struggle with changing systems and manage information and rules and such. But this is what the seniors are struggling with. They want this picture on the wall so that they can have a quick debate and get on with it. But this is our Gov 1. So Gov 0 was the problem definition. Gov 1 is the business model on a page. Gov 2, this is where we take all information that they want to feed us. So this can be audit information, it can be any authoritative information, it can be business plans, it can be project charters, it can wherever they find data that they consider relevant, where the seniors consider this authoritative, and it's not just something that they would dismiss out of hand. We wind up doing a data extraction process, and this goes into a very large template where we extract many values out, and there's a rigor to how we categorize this information, and that's very important later on. So Gov 2 is the data extraction process, and that formulates a table. Next. Then we do what's more important, is we take this data per document and we create a model. And as you can see on the right-hand side, you have the outcomes that are derived from this document, the objectives in the middle, and the capabilities on the left. And it tells me a story right off the bat. So if somebody's authoring a document that's going to be reviewed by executives, I will deconstruct it and model it. And when I do that, what that gives me is a picture. So I can go up there where you see objectives, and then there's some white balls hanging out there, but there's nothing connected to a blue capability. I would say, well, you've talked about the objectives, but you haven't said how you're going to achieve that objective, because you use capabilities to achieve objectives. Okay? And the objectives are a cause-effect relationship to your outcomes. Outcomes can't come true by themselves. You can't assign somebody to an outcome, right? So that's all extracted from this document. And this gives me the way to go back to the author politely and say, I think you forgot to cover this. Because if you got a 50-page Word document or something, nobody can keep all of the variables floating in their head and link everything together. It's terribly difficult. Maybe some people could. I couldn't. So Colt and I figured a way to create a model out of it. And then we use the model to go back to the author and say, hey, we need to tighten up your documentation. Once we get the model tight, that means the document's tight. Then we move on to the next stage, where we take all the documents we're working on, once we've tightened them up, and we put them all together and reduce the redundancies. Because in large systems, you're going to have a lot of people talk about the same things over and over again. So we've got to get rid of redundancies, and we consolidate them, and then we take these outcomes and objectives and we map them to organizational functions, or whatever the scope told us to map it to at the beginning. So if the scope of the initiative was X, then we take all those documents, we extract the data that's relevant to it, and map those to those particular functions. Those cross-map over to the DRIF. Okay? So Departmental Reporting Framework, or good old PAA, right? Next picture. So that gave us the traceability. In the interim, we created another document, which is a deliverable, that takes just the objectives out. And we map them against Peter Drucker's top 10 business domains. And it says, so says Peter Drucker, if you are undertaking an initiative and you don't have at least one objective in every domain, your objective's going to fail. So it became a litmus test. We started to put the objectives in there, and then we could hand that document back to whatever teams were interested in that. So if you had marketing, which, again, according to Drucker, is finding or creating a client. And even inside the government, we do marketing. We have to take care of clients. We have to find out who our client base is, understand them. But let's say we have these 10 domains, one of which is communications, and we go and undertake a particular initiative, and there's no objectives for communications. It's not likely that our initiative is going to be too successful if we're not communicating. So, or the communication expert takes there and says, hey, there should be other objectives in there. And so this gives them the ability, each specialist in that domain, the ability to look at whether or not the right objectives are in the right place. Then, oh boy, this gets very busy, and I apologize for the black lines, but it's what happens when we project something of this complexity. These maps read right to left. If you're reading left to right, you're typically project management. If you're reading right to left, you're typically an executive. Because they're interested in the ultimate outcomes. What do we want to be when we grow up? And then how are we going to get there? And so there's an intermediate mapping to the functions that are going to deliver those particular key outcomes that are underway at the moment. That, on the right-hand side, is your highest level decomposition. Then you just take one of those, I call it function X. In this case, it's actually supply chain. Bring it down and see how it maps down in here. And then we deconstruct that out and understand what the long-term, intermediate, and short-term objectives are, or outcomes are. Those map to the objectives. And then eventually those map to the capabilities. Now we are at the current state of architecture frameworks. Because now I can use an architecture framework such as UAF, or DNDAF, or DODAF, and do capability-based planning, and break down the people, processes, information technology, security, and privacy necessary to describe the capabilities that are required for this particular effort. The beauty of this, though, is once we've mapped this out, when it comes to the auditors, we've got full traceability all the way to the ultimate outcomes, which is the commitment that the department made to cabinet. So any investment or proposed investment into any capabilities, once you've got this made, you've got a system of transparency and traceability that TBS is demanding, and we can provide a graphical traceability for auditors or for Treasury Board. Now, I've spent countless hours working with members in TBS on the architecture side, and this is where they're going. So this is a bit of a picture of where things are going tomorrow. We're working it today. We're trying to work out the bugs in defense. And we are currently working on multiple projects, but these things are monstrous size projects right now. And we're using these tools to establish long-term strategies for the various functions, the NATO-related functions. And then the seniors come in, they see the strategy maps, and they debate a particular area of it. They don't look at the whole picture at one shot. They could if they wanted to, but they typically don't. They come in when there is a disagreement over a particular area and where they need to have decisions made. So this is the traceability side of it, and then on our formal final viewpoint, we create this. It looks really weird and busy, but what it did was it took that capability reference model, and at the top of that reference model there was a life cycle. I didn't get into it because different organizations have their own ideas of what a capability life cycle is. Speaking after me is Matthew House, and Matthew will get into more detail on capability life cycles. He'll know more about it than I do. I don't care. I will adopt whatever the organization is using. As an enterprise architect, I walk in with a toolbox of templates and processes, and I implement them in any organization. I don't need to know about that organization to do my job. I rely on the subject matter experts in that organization to do their job. Now this here is a representation where subject matter experts drove us to develop a fairly unique financial methodology that defense wanted desperately. And that's because, if you remember the time last election, they came into defense and whacked out billions of dollars at one shot. And they would say, okay, just chop. And the seniors would turn around and go, well, where do I take the money from? And so it became, we don't know, just take 10% off everything. Okay, well, that's great in some instances. And then take 10% off System X, and then 25 other systems crash right after it. But that became problematic. So what we did was, utilizing the life cycle, we started to just do green, yellow, red based on what state the life cycle stage was in. And there's a financial amount of money allocated to each one of these particular life cycle stages, all the way up until divestment. Because even divesting like a ship in the military is a huge ordeal. It costs a lot of money because there's a lot of propriety. Everything has to be stripped out and destroyed in a certain way, or we'll never deal with the Americans again. So everything has a cost. And this broke it down into buckets. And this is how the military decided that they wanted to break up their buckets. And then they have their horizons, so 0 to 5 years, 5 to 15, and 15 to 30 years. And what state the capability was in. And so if there's red capabilities, they'd have to figure out, well, we better not take 10% out of that bucket. It's already in deep trouble. But what this gave them the ability to do was to take something that was green, and let's say there's $2 million in R&D sitting under a particular capability, they would pluck out $1 million of that for this fiscal, and they would move it over to this capability that has something that's red, and move it from red to yellow during this fiscal, knowing that that will drop from green to yellow. But they could live with that being yellow. So instead of killing 10% off an entire capability, because, you know, remember, the whole organization is now managing itself solely based on capabilities. Every process is based on capabilities. So if I knock off 10% of one particular capability, that becomes very impactful. It's not like capabilities were dismissed as just a byproduct during the first 2 cycles of the military. So we're at the end of this presentation. I just needed to show you where we took this because we were asked to take it here. The Vice Chief of Defense said, I need a more dynamic way to manage funding than I can manage it today. And we're moving towards capabilities, or we're in capability-based planning. So how can I shuffle money around without having to take it away from an entire capability? So the life cycle became an excellent way of doing that, and it became another architectural view. So those are the views that we have right now that relate specifically to questions that are asked in governing. All right, thank you very much for putting up with us, and appreciate it.